Hello and welcome to Binge, my ongoing series about my favorite authors whose works I would read without even reading a blurb. If you're here for the first time, my name is Amrita, this is my booktube, and if you find that you like this video, then please hit the subscribe button and that bell notification. The author I'd like to discuss today is someone whose work I've loved for a very long time. I think I was probably around 14 or 15 when I first came across her books, and it's been a love affair ever since. Her real name, believe it or not, was Mary Rainbow, but when she first wrote her books and she took it to the publisher, they thought that was too wild and outrageous a name because it sounded so made up. And so she went by her married name, which is Mary Stewart. Now, I've spoken about at least one of her novels before, and considering how young my channel is right now, I think that's a real testament of how much I love her work. The thing I love about Mary Stewart is that she writes these novels that are incredibly literate and imaginative and have such a strong sense of place and are so incredibly well written. I feel like that's something that we are increasingly willing to forget and forgive in writers as long as the plot is interesting or we have a character that we can crush on. Now, Stewart started writing in the mid-20th century when there was a definite demarcation between, say, pulpy writers or, people who wrote trashy books and then people who wrote literature. And then there's like this thin layer of really incredibly talented people who wrote books that were meant for the mass market, but were written with a certain style and a certain literariness that at the time I don't think people really knew what to do with. And so she just sort of got lumped in with people who wrote paperbacks. I mean, this is how long ago she was writing. This was a time when if you were writing paperback novels, then they were looking down on you. That's a long time ago, folks. Now, Stewart wrote a variety of things, and I think her fantasy series, which are sort of fantasy mixed with, historical overtones, because they're about King Arthur. And I think those books are probably ripe for a revival. I personally don't really care for Arthur or like that entire genre of books, but I know that it's a thing that is of continuing interest, at least in the UK and probably in other parts of the world. So for example, we right now have that Netflix series, and I don't care about it to the point where I don't even remember what the name of that is. And I know there's like a giant Merlin fandom, for example, and I wish you all joy, and if you want new stuff, then I highly recommend Mary Stewart. In addition to the Merlin Chronicles, she's also written poems and children's books, and I think one of the children's books is actually an adaptation of one of her adult novels, so I don't really know how that works, but if you would rather look for something that's middle grade, then she has options for that as well. But my enduring love for her comes from her murder mystery novels. The very first murder mystery novel that I read written by her was called Airs Above the Ground, and it was one of those Reader's Digest condensed books that I've spoken about before. Airs Above the Ground is this very classic story of a wife who becomes suspicious when she finds out that her husband, who's away on a business trip, is not where he said he would be. She's convinced that he's having an affair, so she follows him and inadvertently discovers that he's actually a spy or some kind of international policeman. This was incidentally the novel where I first heard about the Lipizzaner horses, which I'd never heard of before, and it was a life goal for years and years and years for me to go to Vienna and to watch the horses perform. And I have to tell you, it was every bit as magical as Stewart made it sound. I mean, I'm not even a horse girl, and I thought it was magic. Her novels are set in post-war Europe with all the transitioning that's going on, and it's still a rather open Western Europe environment. But it's this mix of like the pre-war people and the post-war people, and it really is an unwitting history of a people and a place in transition. And so from a historical perspective, even though these books are not historicals, from a historical perspective, they are so interesting to me because these are people and characters that we don't really get to read anymore. And she always brings a unique perspective to her novels, one that always harkens back to previous times. And they're very English without being nasty about it. By which I mean that it's not a jingoistic nationalism that you get to see in her novels. Her characters are British because she's British, but they don't go through the world as if they own it. Which is probably true to the time, because by the time Stewart was writing her novels in the 1950s and the 1960s, 70s, the world was very different from the colonial Britain that you will see in, say, the Agatha Christie novels. But in my opinion, that only makes these novels more interesting because these characters are more expats or guests or tourists rather than colonial overlords overlooking their colonies. They immediately become more interested in the environment around them and what's happening with the people. And I'm sure that has a lot to do with Stewart herself and who she is as a person, but I can't help but think that it also has to do with the change in national character and in national circumstances. So for example, one of my favorite novels is called This Rough Magic, and it has all these references to The Tempest by Shakespeare, and it's sort of set within a theater setting, but also it has nothing to do with the theater. And that's the kind of literary robustness that she brings to her novels, where there's always a unique perspective, like I mentioned. So one of the central characters in the novel is this older actor who is convinced that Corfu is basically the setting for Shakespeare's The Tempest. And so there are all these references that are scattered through the novel to The Tempest. And at the same time, you have this romance and you have the murder and there's a friendly dolphin. There's all kinds of things going on. Similarly, in Madam Will You Talk, which is possibly my favorite Mary Stewart novel, you have this young woman who is traveling on her own, and she's been widowed by the war and she has all this grief that's pent up in her. And then she meets a little boy and he basically captures her interest and her heart. And then she discovers that he has like this really dark sort of gothic past, which includes a father who's been suspected of murder and is now on his heels and is like tracking him down. And she doesn't know whether, she should save the little boy from his dad or aid and abet him in meeting with his father. I feel like it's a kind of story that we still don't get to see much of. Usually if there's like a little boy with a dad, then the dad is kind of hot and like very wholesome. And meanwhile, you have something like My Brother Michael, which is very much in the tradition of women doing weird, inexplicable things that that they shouldn't do. And they do it anyway for plot reasons, but also, for adventure reasons. There's an adventure, it comes knocking on her door and she's like, why not? And then the murder happens and she's like, oh, that's why not. If you're interested in classic British murder mystery novels or in adventure, spy thriller novels, and you're used to the kind of utilitarian writing and prose that a lot of these novels use, and you'd like something a bit more literary, a bit more interesting, with characters that you're not likely to meet in other novels, then I highly, highly recommend Mary Stewart. And of course, if you're into fantasy and you are into King Arthur, then, you could do a lot worse than the Merlin Chronicles, which I think have been adapted to film as well, but I'm not exactly sure because have I mentioned that I don't really care for the King Arthur lore? I'm sorry. You know what I like? Murder. You know who writes amazing murder novels? Mary Stewart. For more videos, please hit the subscribe button.